When a person decides to get themselves an owl that they're going to keep, they would usually opt for a young bird that they can hand rear to be nice and tame for handling and flying. But sometimes they would get themselves an adult owl that was previously hand reared that kind of comes tame and fully grown that you can then handle and train to fly. And usually, if the bird is a good one, this works out quite well. Sometimes that bird will come into its new home and be a bit nervous of its surroundings, but they'll calm down fairly quickly and remain a pretty good steady owl. Today I'd like to tell you a story that goes back to 2016 relating to a very anxious snowy owl. Now, I have worked with snowy owls before. There was one back at the Bird of Prey Centre I used to work at. We had somebody who used to volunteer for us who got their own baby one and they hand reared it and we used to handle it on displays. And in 2020 there was a farm attraction that was applying for a zoo license. They failed. They had lovely big enclosures, but the timber was rotten and I could see they weren't going to get their license. So they suddenly had loads of reptiles and birds of prey they needed to find a temporary home for. So we actually, in the middle of lockdown then, said, look, we've got some space, and we took on a pair of snowy owls and we kept them for a few months before their new home was found. And the male wasn't very tame, but the female was actually a really tame bird, as seen here in this video that I did called Focus on the Snowy Owl, and it just happened to have been snowing recently, which is really fortunate for the filming of that video. So with that in mind, I am not a complete novice when it comes to the snowy owl, and sometimes people do ask me, oh, would you ever get a snowy owl? Because they are quite a famous species and they are very beautiful. And I always say no, because they're built for really cold conditions. So they're not great in our summers and not great for flying shows either when the sun's out. They just get very warm very quickly. And I have known them as well, in my experience, to be quite aggressive birds, and they can be quite nervous. And that links perfectly onto this particular owl that is the topic of this video. So I used to know a gentleman who had a similar business to mine doing owl handling and flying shows, and he had a young snowy owl that I remember seeing in his living room, all fluffy, being hand reared with the children and a dog and so on. And 3 or 4 months later, he called me and said, Ryan, I'm actually closing down the owl handling business and we're going into falconry pest control instead, which is hawks and falcons flying around to scare off pigeon and seagull and such. So he was rehoming his owls. And he said, I've got this snowy owl, you saw it being hand reared, £250, you can have the bird. And I said, well, no, thank you. It's not the sort of bird we want, really. You know, I'll leave you to find someone else. But he kept ringing me and texting me. He hounded one of my volunteers. And in the end, he said, look, just come and have it. Just come and get it. And I said, oh, do you know what? Let's just go and get it. Take it off his hands. We'll see what it's like. We'll find a good home for it. It shuts the man up. So my assistant went, brought it back, put it in an aviary, had a spare aviary back in the woods at the time. And I had a look through the mesh and I said, you can tell that owl is not happy. In fact, you don't need to be an expert in the body language of an owl to see that it was looking very, very scared of its new environment. It was sat there on the floor with its eyes wide open, daren't move. So I said, look, we've got to be very, very careful here. This can be dangerous to the bird. We're not going to go in. We're not going to try and handle it. We're going to put food through the mesh so it can eat. We're not even going to clean the aviary. Let's give it a few days to see if it will just calm down. Unfortunately, about 6 days later, we found it dead. The anxiety had actually killed that owl. Now, this is the one and only time this has ever happened to me, and it really is a valuable lesson to learn, which is why I'm doing this video, so that if you're thinking of getting an adult owl yourself at some point, you've got this nugget of information from my experience that you can hopefully help to avoid it happening to yourself. Now, it's a bit of a tricky one. You can go and see an owl in its home, you could handle it, it's perfectly tame, perfectly fine. It's not until you get it home that it suddenly freaks out, doesn't like where it is, and you've got a problem. Although that is really rare. Usually if I go and see an owl and handle it, it's absolutely fine. But it can happen, certain species, the snowy owl definitely one of them, where they can just be a bit too nervous and its anxiety just took over and maybe it had a heart attack, it's hard to say. It was certainly eating, so it wasn't that it died of starvation or dehydration. I imagine what's happened is this hand-reared snowy owl was put into an aviary and probably wasn't handled for a couple of months while they decided what they're going to do, owl handling, falconry, pest control, whatever, and then said, right, we've got to rehome the owls. So that means that in that crucial part of its life, as it's learning how to survive in the wild at that age, instead it would be learning how to free fly for its food or whatever, instead of having that training and that attention, it was probably put in an aviary, just fed, not really dealt with. So it lost quite a bit of its tameness, which is probably why he was willing to give me the bird for free. So a bit of a sad story, but I thought an important one to put across. We want to avoid this ever happening, and it made me realise recently while thinking of ideas for this channel that I've got so many stories, so many experiences, the mistakes that I've made, the things I've learned. It would just be plain wrong to not share them with you, especially if you're thinking of keeping birds of prey yourself, as I know many of the people who watch this channel are.